The morning of December 22nd, 1944, snow fell across the Ardennes like ash from a funeral pyre, blanketing frozen earth and the bodies of men who had died believing the war was nearly won. In a command post hastily erected beneath the ruins of a Belgian farmhouse, Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein stood before a map smeared with pencil marks and coffee stains. His breath clouded in the frigid air as he traced the American positions with a finger that no longer trembled, though his heart did. The numbers arriving from his staff officers carried a rhythm he had heard before, in Russia, in the retreat from Kursk. But this was different. This was not the slow, grinding death of attrition. This was speed incarnate, a force that moved with a velocity that defied every principle of military science he had learned at the war colleges of Prussia. Patton's Third Army had pivoted 90 degrees in 48 hours, disengaging from offensive operations in the Saar, wheeling north through winter roads choked with ice, and was now hammering against the southern flank of the German Bulge with a fury that seemed more elemental than tactical. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Impossible, Bayerlein muttered, not to anyone in particular but to the ghost of certainty that had haunted him since Normandy. He had commanded Panzer Lehr, once the elite of Germany's armoured forces, now a shattered remnant rebuilding in the Eifel Mountains. He knew armour, he knew logistics, he knew the immutable laws of fuel consumption and supply lines stretched thin as wire across frozen landscapes. And yet here stood the proof, scrawled in red ink across yellowing paper, that those laws had been rewritten by a man in pearl-handled revolvers and a helmet polished bright as a mirror. Outside, the artillery continued its percussion, a drumbeat marking time in a war that no longer followed the old rhythms. Bayerlein had fought at El Alamein under Rommel, had seen the British methodical grinding advance, had witnessed Montgomery's careful orchestration of firepower and manoeuvre. The Americans, he had assumed, would fight the same way, methodical, predictable, slow. But Patton was not Montgomery, and the Third Army was not an army in any sense that Bayerlein understood. It was a torrent, a cascade of steel and gasoline and relentless forward motion that paid no heed to the obstacles that should have stopped it. The winter should have stopped it. The lack of supply depots should have stopped it. The sheer audacity of turning an entire field army through 90 degrees in the midst of a German offensive should have been impossible. Yet it had happened, and Bayerlein, staring at his map, felt something crack inside his chest. Not fear exactly, though fear was present. It was recognition, the recognition that the Germany he had fought for, the Wehrmacht that had once seemed invincible, was being outmatched not by superior tactics or better soldiers, but by something more fundamental, by a nation that could simply build more, move faster, and refuse to stop. To understand how shocking Patton's achievement truly was, one must first understand the doctrine that governed warfare in 1944. The Germans had written the book on mobile warfare, on blitzkrieg, on the rapid exploitation of breakthroughs. They had invented the concept of the armoured spearhead, the deep penetration, the encirclement that crushed armies before they could react. Every German officer had studied the campaigns of 1940, when panzers had raced to the Channel in days, collapsing France like a house of cards. But those campaigns had been meticulously planned, with supply depots established in advance, with fuel trucks positioned along carefully scouted routes, with infantry following behind to consolidate gains. The idea of turning an entire army, not a division or a corps but an entire field army, through a right angle in the middle of winter, while under combat, and then advancing at speed. It violated every principle they had ever been taught. The Third Army had become operational on August 1st, 1944, bursting through the gap at Avranches like water through a broken dam. From that moment forward, it had operated at a tempo that left even its own supply officers gasping. Patton drove his men with a ferocity that bordered on madness, sleeping 4 hours a night, covering hundreds of miles in his jeep to visit forward units, cursing, cajoling, threatening, inspiring. His philosophy was simple to the point of brutality. Keep moving, because a moving army is a living army, and a stopped army is a dead one. By September, the Third Army had raced 400 miles across France in 30 days, capturing territory at a rate unprecedented in American military history. Towns fell so quickly that maps could not be updated fast enough. German units, still reeling from the destruction at Falaise, melted away before the advance like snow in spring. Patton boasted that his army had moved farther and faster than any army in history, and while German generals would later quibble with the claim, pointing to their own advances into Russia in 1941, none could deny the psychological impact. Then came the halt. Eisenhower, facing the logistical reality of armies outrunning their supply lines, ordered Patton to stop at the Moselle River in early September. The decision was sound from a strategic perspective. The port of Antwerp had been captured but not yet cleared, and every gallon of gasoline, every artillery shell, every K-Russian had to be trucked from Normandy along roads the Germans had systematically destroyed. But to Patton, it was agony. He had reached the German frontier. The Siegfried Line lay within striking distance, and he was ordered to sit still. The pause gave the Germans time to breathe, to reorganize, to fortify. What had been a rout became a coherent defense, and when Patton finally received permission to resume offensive operations in mid-September, he found himself facing not the shattered remnants of a beaten army, but a renewed enemy fighting from prepared positions. The result was the Lorraine campaign, 3 months of grinding, bloody warfare that tested even Patton's aggressive spirit. Metz became his obsession and his torment. The ancient fortress city, ringed by forts built by the Germans after 1870 and reinforced over decades, defied every assault. American casualties mounted, tanks bogged down in mud, infantry attacked fortifications that artillery could barely dent. Critics within the American High Command whispered that Patton had lost his touch, that he should have bypassed Metz and driven north to cut off the German 7th Army. German commanders, interviewed after the war, said the same thing. Generaloberst Johannes Blaskowitz, reviewing Patton's tactics, observed that a direct attack on Metz had been unnecessary, that a thrust toward Luxembourg and Bitburg would have achieved far greater results, but Patton pressed forward with grim determination. To him, Metz was not merely a military objective, it was a test of wills, a proving ground for divisions that had been blooded in Normandy and needed hardening. "We're using Metz to blood the new divisions," he told General Omar Bradley, his superior, when Bradley urged him to abandon the assault. The explanation rang hollow to some, but Patton would not yield. The Third Army suffered 50,000 casualties in Lorraine, approximately 1/3 of all the casualties it would sustain in the entire European war, to advance barely 40 to 60 miles. By late November, when Metz finally fell, the city yielded only 6,000 prisoners, a fraction of what had been expected. The fortress had served its purpose for the Germans, delaying Patton for 3 months, allowing German forces to withdraw to the Saar River and reorganize behind the Siegfried Line. To many observers, Lorraine represented Patton's least successful campaign, a brutal slog that seemed to contradict everything his reputation promised. And then came December. Intelligence reports had been arriving at Patton's headquarters for weeks. Colonel Oskar Koch, his intelligence officer, was not a man given to panic or exaggeration. He studied maps with the precision of a watchmaker examining gears, and what he saw disturbed him. German divisions were massing in the Ardennes, that forested, hilly region to Patton's north, where the American First Army held a thinly defended line. Ammunition dumps were being established, fuel reserves stockpiled. By December 9th, Koch calculated that the Germans possessed a 2-to-1 manpower advantage in the sector. Patton listened. Unlike many generals who dismissed intelligence that contradicted their assumptions, Patton trusted Koch implicitly. On December 10th, he ordered his staff to begin contingency planning for a possible German offensive in the Ardennes. 3 scenarios were developed, each involving the Third Army disengaging from its current operations in the Saar and pivoting north to strike the flank of any German penetration. Maps were prepared, routes were scouted, unit commanders were quietly briefed. "We'll be in a position to meet whatever happens," Patton told his staff. The words would prove prophetic in ways even he could not have imagined. On December 16th, at 5:30 in the morning, the Germans launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, their last great offensive in the West. 29 divisions, numbering 250,000 men, smashed into the American lines in the Ardennes under cover of fog and snow. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise. American positions, manned by units recuperating from earlier battles or by green divisions fresh from the States, collapsed under the weight of the assault. Entire regiments were surrounded. Roads became clogged with retreating soldiers and fleeing civilians. Panic rippled through the American command. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, called an emergency conference at Verdun on the morning of December 19th. The atmosphere in the room was grim. Maps showed a bulge driven deep into American lines, threatening to split the Allied armies and potentially reach the vital supply port of Antwerp. Some officers were already discussing defensive positions, fallback lines, contingencies for evacuation. Patton walked into the conference with his jaw set and his eyes bright. While others saw crisis, he saw opportunity. "This is a chance to destroy them," he said. Where others saw crisis, Eisenhower saw opportunity. Eisenhower turned to him. "When can you attack?" he asked. Patton's answer stunned the room. "The morning of December 22nd, he said. 3 days. The other generals stared. Eisenhower's chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith, leaned forward. "George," he said carefully, "you're engaged in heavy fighting around Saarbrücken. You're talking about disengaging 6 divisions, moving them north through winter conditions on roads choked with refugees, and launching a coordinated attack against the southern flank of a German offensive. In 3 days. Are you serious?" Patton's smile was thin and cold. "I've already given the orders," he said. "My staff has 3 plans prepared. I telephoned them before I left for this meeting and told them to execute. We'll hit them with 3 divisions initially, followed by 3 more within a week." The room erupted in a mixture of disbelief and admiration. Moving a single division in winter was a logistical nightmare. Moving 6 while under enemy pressure was considered nearly impossible by conventional military doctrine. But Patton had already anticipated the need. His foresight, his refusal to accept that the war was proceeding according to plan, had positioned him to accomplish what everyone else deemed impossible. On December 22nd, elements of the 3rd Army's 4th Armoured Division, 26th Infantry Division, and 80th Infantry Division struck the southern flank of the German Bulge. The Germans, focused on their drive west toward the Meuse River, were caught by surprise. American tanks and infantry, moving with speed that defied the weather and the terrain, began to compress the salient from the south. The relief of Bastogne became the focal point. The Belgian crossroads town, garrisoned by the 101st Airborne Division under Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, had been surrounded since December 20th. The Germans had demanded surrender. McAuliffe's reply, delivered on December 22nd, consisted of a single word: nuts. The response became legendary, a symbol of American defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. But defiance alone would not save Bastogne. The town needed relief, and it needed it quickly. Patton drove his forces mercilessly. The 4th Armoured Division, under Major General Hugh Gaffey, led the thrust toward Bastogne, fighting through snow and ice and determined German resistance. Every mile was contested. German paratroopers and Volksgrenadier units, fighting with the desperation of men who knew their offensive was faltering, threw themselves against the American advance. Tanks duelled at close range in villages reduced to rubble. Artillery fire turned the snow red. On December 26th, at 4:45 in the afternoon, lead elements of the 4th Armoured Division, specifically Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams's 37th Tank Battalion, broke through to Bastogne. The siege was lifted. Supplies poured into the town. The 101st Airborne, having held for 6 days against overwhelming odds, was reinforced and resupplied. The German offensive, already running out of fuel and momentum, began to collapse. In a bunker carved into frozen earth near St. Vith, General Major Siegfried von Waldenberg pressed his palms against a table that vibrated with each distant explosion. His 116th Panzer Division, once a proud formation that had fought across Russia and France, was now being crushed between 2 grinding stones. From the north, the American First Army was counterattacking with methodical precision. From the south came something else entirely, something that moved with a speed that made no tactical sense. Von Waldenberg had received the reports with disbelief that morning. Patton's Third Army, which intelligence had placed firmly in the Saar region, heavily engaged around the fortress of Dillingen, was now appearing on his southern flank in division strength. Not reconnaissance elements, not advanced guards, full divisions with armor, artillery, and infantry in coordinated formations. The timeline was impossible. The staff officers insisted there must be an error in identification, that these were elements of the First Army redeploying, not the Third. But the radio intercepts told a different story. The voices on American frequencies were using Third Army call signs. Prisoners captured that morning wore the shoulder patches of units that had been fighting 50 miles to the south just days earlier. Von Waldenberg studied his maps with the methodical care of a man trained in Prussian staff colleges, and the conclusion was inescapable and terrifying. Patton had done what no German commander would have dared attempt. He had pivoted an entire field army through 90 degrees in the middle of winter, during active combat operations, and launched a coordinated offensive against a prepared enemy position. "How many divisions does he have?" Von Waldenberg asked his intelligence officer, a young Hauptmann whose face had aged a decade in the past week. The Hauptmann consulted his notes with hands that shook slightly. "Initial contact with elements of 3 divisions confirmed, Herr General, the 4th Armoured, the 26th Infantry, the 80th Infantry. Reports suggest 3 more divisions are moving north behind them, the 5th Infantry, the 90th Infantry, the 4th Infantry. 6 divisions. Von Waldenberg felt something cold settle in his stomach. That represented roughly 150,000 men, 500 tanks, over 1,000 artillery pieces. An entire corps, perhaps more, all moving with a unity of purpose that suggested meticulous planning. Yet the planning had to have been done in advance, before the German offensive even launched, which meant Patton had anticipated this moment, had prepared for it, and had positioned his forces to respond with a speed that violated every principle of logistics and command. The Hauptmann continued, his voice dropping. Interrogation of American prisoners suggests that General Patton gave orders to his staff to prepare contingency plans for this operation on December 10th, 6 days before our offensive began. The orders to execute were given on December 19th, while he was at a conference in Verdun. The attack commenced at 22nd. Von Waldenberg did the arithmetic in his head. Patton had received confirmation of the German offensive on December 19th. He had issued orders, and 3 days later, 6 divisions were in motion, attacking in coordinated fashion with air support and artillery preparation. 3 days. The standard doctrine, the one taught at every military academy in Germany, stated that moving a single division from one sector to another required at least 5 days of preparation. Roads had to be cleared, supply dumps established. Units had to be pulled from the line in sequence to avoid creating gaps the enemy could exploit. Artillery had to be displaced, ammunition stockpiled, fuel reserves positioned. The idea of moving 6 divisions, while under enemy pressure, in winter conditions, and launching them into an immediate offensive? It was madness. It was impossible. Yet it had happened. "What are our fuel reserves?" Von Waldenberg asked, though he already knew the answer. The Hauptmann's expression answered before his words did. "Critically low, Herr General. The Führer's offensive was predicated on capturing American fuel dumps. We did not. Our panzers are running on fumes. Some units are already immobilized." There it was, the fundamental asymmetry that defined this war in its final phase. The Germans could still design brilliant machines, could still produce officers trained in the finest military traditions, could still field soldiers willing to fight with fanatic determination, but they could not conjure gasoline from thin air, they could not replace losses at the rate the Americans could, and they could not match the sheer operational tempo of an enemy who seemed to possess infinite resources and the will to use them without hesitation. Von Waldenberg thought of the Tiger tanks scattered across Belgium, magnificent machines with guns that could kill any Allied tank at 2,000 meters, now sitting immobile because there was no fuel to move them. He thought of the Volksgrenadier divisions, filled with boys of 16 and men of 50, armed with rifles and Panzerfausts and little else. He thought of the Luftwaffe, which had promised air support for the offensive, but could barely put 50 planes in the air, while American fighters and bombers darkened the sky in formations of hundreds. And he thought of Patton, that American cowboy general whom German intelligence had initially dismissed as a showman, a buffoon with pearl-handled pistols and a talent for self-promotion but little else. The intelligence assessments from early 1944 had barely mentioned him. When they did, it was with contempt. The Americans, the report stated, relied on material superiority to compensate for tactical incompetence. Their generals were cautious, methodical, and predictable. How spectacularly wrong those assessments had proven. Patton was not cautious. He was not methodical in the sense the Germans understood methodology. He was something else entirely, something that German doctrine had no framework to comprehend. He was an aggression incarnate, motion weaponized, a general who understood that in modern mechanized warfare, tempo was a weapon as deadly as any tank gun. The German officers who had faced Patton in North Africa, in Sicily, in France, came to recognize a pattern in his operations. He did not fight to capture territory. He fought to destroy enemy forces. He did not consolidate gains before advancing. He advanced to consolidate. His supply officers tore their hair out trying to keep pace with his demands. His superiors, Bradley and Eisenhower, spent countless hours reining him in, preventing him from outrunning his logistics so far that he would be cut off and destroyed. But Patton always seemed to know exactly how far he could push. In Sicily, he had raced Montgomery to Messina, driving his 7th Army up the northern coast of the island with reckless speed that left German and Italian forces reeling. The campaign was supposed to be Montgomery's show, a methodical advance up the eastern coast while the Americans played a supporting role. Instead, Patton had stolen the glory, reaching Messina first and infuriating his British colleague. In France, after the breakout from Normandy, Patton's Third Army had swept across the countryside like a brush fire. German commanders, accustomed to the slow, grinding advances they had faced from the Soviets in the east and the British in the west, found themselves unable to establish defensive lines. By the time they had identified where the American spearheads were, those spearheads had already moved on, 20 or 30 miles further east. The German First Army commander, General Otto von Knobelsdorff, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had covered 800 miles in 6 weeks during Operation Barbarossa, later admitted grudging respect for Patton's operational speed. But respect and admiration were different animals. The Germans respected Rommel for his tactical brilliance in North Africa. They admired Guderian for his revolutionary concepts of armoured warfare. What they felt for Patton was something closer to bewilderment tinged with dread. He broke rules they did not even know could be broken. He accomplished things that violated the fundamental principles of military science as they understood it. When the Third Army reached the German border in September 1944, German commanders had breathed a collective sigh of relief. The Americans had outrun their supplies. They would have to pause, to consolidate, to build up logistics for the final push into Germany. The pause would give the Germans time to fortify the Siegfried Line, to bring up reserves, to prepare a defence in depth that would make every mile cost the Americans dearly. And indeed, Patton had been forced to halt. The Lorraine campaign that followed seemed to confirm German assumptions. The Third Army was mortal after all. It could be stopped, could be bled, could be frustrated by determined resistance and strong fortifications. German officers who had feared that the war might end by Christmas 1944 began to believe that they might hold out through the winter, might even survive until spring, when new miracle weapons promised by the propaganda ministry would turn the tide. Then came the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's great gamble to split the Allied armies and recapture Antwerp. The plan was audacious, perhaps overly so, but it had achieved complete tactical surprise. The Americans had been caught flat-footed. The initial penetration had been spectacular. For 48 hours, it seemed as though lightning might strike twice, as though Blitzkrieg might return to save the Reich. And then Patton had pivoted his entire army and attacked with speed that made the German advance look ponderous by comparison. The Wehrmacht had taken 3 weeks to plan the Ardennes offensive. Patton had responded in 3 days. The contrast was stark and humiliating. In the village of Haufelais, at the northern tip of what would become known as the Bulge, Oberstleutnant Hans Joachim Kahler stood in the ruins of a church and watched American artillery shells marching across the landscape like the footsteps of an angry god. His regiment, part of the 2nd Panzer Division, had advanced further west than any other German unit during the offensive. They had come within 4 miles of the Meuse River, tantalizingly close to their objective. Now they were fighting for survival. Kahler was 32 years old, a veteran of Poland, France, Russia, and North Africa. He had seen triumph and disaster, victory and defeat. He prided himself on his professional competence, his ability to assess military situations with cold objectivity, and his objective assessment, standing in that ruined church on December 27, 1944, was that Germany had lost the war. Not because of any single tactical defeat, not because of superior Allied equipment or tactics, but because of what Patton's response to the Ardennes offensive revealed about the fundamental imbalance between the two sides. The Americans possessed not merely more tanks, more planes, more artillery. They possessed something more deadly: operational flexibility on a scale the Germans could no longer match. A young lieutenant approached, his uniform caked with frozen mud, his face grey with exhaustion. "Herr Oberstleutnant, orders from division. We are to withdraw to the Arther River and establish defensive positions." Kahler nodded. Another retreat, another defensive line that would hold for a day, maybe 2, before being overwhelmed by American firepower and numerical superiority. "How many tanks are operational?" he asked. 4, the lieutenant replied. "Out of 43 we started with." 4 tanks. Kahler felt a laugh rise in his throat, bitter and harsh. 4 tanks to hold a regimental sector against an enemy that seemed to multiply like bacteria. Every time they destroyed an American Sherman, 2 more appeared. Every artillery barrage they weathered was followed by another twice as heavy. Every position they fortified was bypassed or obliterated. "And the Third Army?" Kahler asked. The lieutenant consulted a message form, reading by the light of a burning barn across the street. "Intelligence reports 6 divisions now engaged on our southern flank. The 5th Infantry Division has been identified near Diekirch. The 90th is pushing toward Bastogne. Armour is everywhere." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this, everywhere. That was the word that defined the American advantage. Not better, not more sophisticated, simply everywhere. The Third Army was everywhere because it could afford to be everywhere. It had the trucks to move infantry at speeds German foot-marching columns could never match. It had the fuel to keep those trucks running day and night. It had the radios to coordinate movements across dozens of miles in real time. It had the air support to scout ahead, to strike targets of opportunity, to interdict German supply lines while protecting its own. And it had Patton, who drove his men with a fury that bordered on cruelty, but who understood that in mechanized warfare, hesitation was death. His soldiers cursed him, called him old blood and guts, with a mixture of resentment and pride. Our blood, his guts, they joked, but they also followed him, because Patton's aggressive tactics, for all their cost, achieved results faster and often with fewer total casualties than cautious, methodical approaches. Kahler remembered reading a captured American training manual months earlier. The manual had outlined principles of armored warfare that any German officer would have recognized: reconnaissance, concentration of force, exploitation of breakthrough, pursuit of defeated enemies. But there had been one section that had struck him as peculiarly American. It discussed the importance of maintenance and logistics, of keeping vehicles running even at the expense of tactical perfection. "A tank that runs is worth 10 that sits broken," the manual had stated. "Do not wait for perfect conditions. Move with what you have and fix problems on the march." The philosophy was crude, inelegant, lacking in the intellectual rigor that German doctrine prized, but it worked. American tanks were simpler than German panzers, less sophisticated, easier to repair. When a Sherman threw a track, a crew could fix it in an hour. When a Tiger broke down, it required specialized tools and trained mechanics, and often had to be abandoned. The Americans could afford simplicity because they had quantity. They could lose 3 Shermans to destroy 1 Panther and still come out ahead because they had 50 more Shermans behind those 3. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. Germany was fighting an arithmetic war with an enemy who had mastered multiplication. By early January 1945, the German salient in the Ardennes had been reduced to a shrinking pocket. American forces pressed from north and south, squeezing the Bulge like a vice. German commanders ordered withdrawal after withdrawal, each time abandoning equipment they could not replace, leaving behind wounded they could not evacuate, sacrificing rear guards that would never be reinforced. The Führer, in his bunker in Berlin, raged against the failure. He blamed his generals for lacking sufficient will, blamed the weather for clearing and allowing American aircraft to dominate the skies, blamed everyone except himself and the fundamental miscalculation that had doomed the offensive from the start. The Wehrmacht had gambled on capturing American fuel dumps to sustain its advance. When those dumps were not captured, the offensive had been strangled by its own logistics. Patton's Third Army, by contrast, never lacked for fuel. Supply convoys rolled day and night, trucks grinding along icy roads in endless columns. When roads were blocked, engineers bulldozed new ones. When bridges were destroyed, pontoon bridges appeared within hours. The American logistics system was not elegant, not efficient in the Prussian sense of minimizing waste. It was brute force logistics, overwhelming problems with sheer volume of material rather than clever planning. But it worked. And in war, what works is what matters. General der Panzertruppen Hasse von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army during the Ardennes offensive, he later reflected on the campaign with the bitterness of a man who had done everything tactically correct and still lost. His troops had achieved complete surprise. His initial penetration had been deep and rapid. His subordinate commanders had fought with skill and determination. And yet, within 10 days of launching the offensive, he had known it was doomed. The Americans recovered too quickly, he told interrogators after the war. They absorb losses that would cripple any European army and simply bring up more units. We destroyed entire battalions, and by the next day, fresh battalions were in their place. We knocked out their tanks, and more tanks appeared. It was like fighting the sea. When asked specifically about Patton's response to the offensive, von Manteuffel's expression had darkened. His speed was unexpected, he admitted. We knew the Third Army was engaged in the Saar. We calculated it would take at minimum 10 days for him to disengage, reposition, and mount a coherent attack. Instead, he struck us in 3 days with full divisions. Our southern flank was supposed to be our secure flank. Instead, it became the point of our defeat. The admission was damning. The Germans had planned the Ardennes offensive for months, massing 29 divisions in secrecy, stockpiling ammunition and fuel, coordinating the assault down to the minute, and an American general, receiving word of the attack during a conference, had improvised a response that turned the German victory into a German disaster. Not through brilliant tactics, not through technological superiority, but through sheer operational speed and the willingness to take risks that made German staff officers blanch. The numbers told the story with cold precision. Between August 1st, 1944, when the Third Army became operational, and May 9th, 1945, when the war in Europe ended, Patton's forces had fought for 281 consecutive days. They had crossed 24 major rivers and innumerable smaller streams. They had captured 81,500 square miles of territory, including more than 12,000 cities, towns, and villages. They had claimed to have killed, wounded, or captured over 1.8 million German soldiers, though post-war analysis suggested the number was closer to 1.4 million. The Third Army had suffered 139,646 casualties, including 16,596 killed in action. The ratio of German to American casualties was approximately 10 to 1. The Third Army had inflicted more damage on the Wehrmacht than any other Allied army of comparable size. But the statistics, impressive as they were, did not capture the psychological impact. German officers, who had begun the war with contempt for American military capability, ended it with grudging respect, tinged with bewilderment. They could not understand how an army could operate at such tempo, could sustain such losses and simply replace them, could advance so rapidly across terrain that should have been defensible. Generaloberst Alfred Jodl, chief of operations at the German High Command, reviewing Allied operations in the final months of the war, noted that Patton's Third Army represented a new form of warfare. Not better than German doctrine, he insisted, but different. They do not fight to capture objectives, he observed. They fight to destroy our forces. They accept casualties that we would consider catastrophic because they know those casualties will be replaced. It is a form of warfare that relies on material abundance, and against such abundance, skill and determination are not enough. The admission was bitter but accurate. Germany had entered the war believing that superior training, better doctrine, and more advanced technology would compensate for material disadvantages. By 1945, that belief lay in ruins alongside the cities of the Reich. The Third Army, with its simple Sherman tanks and its aggressive, sometimes crude tactics, had proven that quantity had a quality all its own. When that quantity was wielded by a commander who understood how to maintain tempo, how to keep the enemy off balance, and how to turn logistics into a weapon as deadly as any gun, the result was unstoppable. February 1945. The Rhine River lay ahead like a silver ribbon draped across the corpse of the Reich. Lieutenant Colonel Hans Dietrich Genscher stood on the east bank near Koblenz, watching American artillery flashes illuminate the western horizon in rhythmic pulses, like the heartbeat of a machine that never tired. Behind him, the city burned with a low, sullen intensity, smoke rising in columns that merged with the grey winter sky until earth and heaven seemed indistinguishable. Genscher was 41 years old, too old to believe in fairy tales about miracle weapons, and too young to accept that his entire adult life had been spent in service to a lie. He had joined the Wehrmacht in 1925, when Germany was still recovering from the humiliation of Versailles, still dreaming of restoration and revenge. He had climbed through the ranks on merit, had served with distinction in Poland and France, had earned his Iron Cross in the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. Now he commanded a Kampfgruppe of perhaps 300 men, scraped together from a dozen shattered units, armed with a hodgepodge of weapons and sustained by little more than habit, and the knowledge that surrender meant captivity under uncertain conditions. The Americans were coming. Not today, perhaps, not tomorrow, but soon. The pattern had been established over months of retreat. The Americans would mass artillery, hundreds of guns firing in coordination that spoke to industrial capacity Germany could no longer match. Then would come the aircraft, waves of fighter bombers that owned the sky absolutely. Then the tanks, green Shermans advancing in formation with infantry clinging to their hulls, and behind them, always behind them, came the endless columns of supply trucks, the repair vehicles, the fuel tankers, the ammunition carriers, the vast logistical apparatus that allowed the Americans to keep fighting day after day without pause. Genscher's own supply situation could be summarized in 3 words. There was none. His men had ammunition for perhaps one sustained engagement, food for 2 days if they stretched it, fuel for the handful of vehicles they still possessed, enough to move 5 miles, maybe 10. Medical supplies consisted of bandages and morphine, nothing more. When men were wounded seriously, the best Genscher could offer was morphine and a prayer. He thought of Patton, whose Third Army was now pushing through the Palatinate to the south, sweeping aside German resistance with the casual efficiency of a man swatting flies. The intelligence summaries that still trickled down from higher headquarters painted a picture of relentless advance. The Third Army had taken Trier on March 1st, capturing the ancient Roman city with just 2 divisions when Eisenhower's staff had calculated it would require 4. Patton's response when ordered to bypass the city had become legendary. "Have taken Trier with 2 divisions. Do you want me to give it back?" The arrogance of the statement should have infuriated Genscher. Instead, he found himself experiencing something closer to grim admiration. Patton understood something that German commanders had forgotten in their obsession with operational art and tactical excellence. He understood that war was not about elegant maneuvers or brilliant stratagems. It was about breaking the enemy's will to resist, and the fastest way to break that will was to advance with such speed and force that resistance seemed futile. A runner appeared, a boy of perhaps 17 with a face grey from exhaustion and fear. "Herr Oberstleutnant," he gasped. "Report from forward observers." American tanks spotted near Bendorf. 20, perhaps 30 vehicles. Infantry in trucks behind them. Genscher nodded slowly. 20 tanks. His Kampfgruppe possessed 1 operational anti-tank gun and a dozen Panzerfausts. Against 20 Shermans, supported by infantry and artillery, they might destroy 3 or 4 vehicles before being overrun. The mathematics were simple and brutal. "Order the men to prepare fallback positions to the east," Genscher said. "We will delay them as long as possible, then withdraw across the Rhine before they can encircle us." The runner saluted and disappeared into the smoke. Delay and withdraw. Those were the only orders Genscher had given for months now. Delay the Americans for an hour, for a day if possible, then withdraw to the next defensive line. Each withdrawal brought them deeper into Germany, closer to the heartland that propaganda had promised would never be touched by enemy boots. The final offensive came with the inevitability of a guillotine blade falling. On March 22, 1945, elements of the Third Army's 5th Infantry Division crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim, south of Mainz, establishing a bridgehead on the eastern bank before German forces could organize effective resistance. Patton had beaten Montgomery to the crossing, had stolen the glory of being first across the Rhine just as he had stolen the race to Messina in Sicily. The British Field Marshal, with his methodical planning and massive set-piece preparations, had been scheduled to cross the Rhine on March 24, with the full weight of 21st Army Group behind him. Instead, Patton crossed 2 days early, with minimal preparation and maximum speed. The crossing at Oppenheim was vintage Patton, aggressive, opportunistic, and executed with a speed that left German commanders reeling. By the time higher headquarters at Army Group B realized what was happening, the Americans had already established a bridgehead 3 miles deep and were pouring reinforcements across pontoon bridges that engineers had erected in darkness. German counterattacks, launched piecemeal as units arrived at the front, were shredded by American artillery and air support. Generaloberst Johannes Blaskowitz, commanding Army Group G facing the Third Army, stared at the reports with the numb acceptance of a man watching his own execution. He had fought Patton in Lorraine, had managed to delay him for 3 months around Metz, had inflicted significant casualties, and demonstrated that the Third Army was not invincible. But that had been when German forces had time to prepare, when fortifications could be occupied, when supply lines were still functioning. Now, in March 1945, there were no supplies to speak of. The Luftwaffe was a ghost force, capable of launching perhaps a few dozen sorties per day against American air armadas numbering in the thousands. German units were filled with boys and old men, undertrained and under-equipped, their morale sustained only by fear of what would happen if they retreated without orders. The Wehrmacht that had conquered Europe in 1940 was a memory, replaced by a hollow shell that fought with courage, born of desperation but without hope of victory. How far has the Third Army advanced since crossing the Rhine? Blaskowitz asked his intelligence officer, a major who had aged a decade in 6 months. The major consulted his map, tracing routes with a finger that trembled slightly. The reconnaissance elements are reported near Aschaffenburg, Herr Generaloberst, that is, approximately 50 kilometers from the crossing point. In 2 days. 50 kilometers. Blaskowitz closed his eyes. In Poland, in 1939, the Wehrmacht's panzer divisions had advanced faster than that, had covered hundreds of kilometers in weeks, had shattered the Polish army before it could properly mobilize. But that had been against an enemy without modern equipment, without air support, without the vast material resources that allowed rapid recovery from setbacks. The Americans were different. They advanced at speeds that seemed reckless, until one realized that recklessness worked when you could absorb losses and replace them overnight. "Order all units to fall back to the main river," Blaskowitz said heavily. "We cannot stop them at the Rhine. Perhaps we can delay them at the Main." The major saluted and left to transmit the orders. Blaskowitz remained standing before his map, studying the red arrows that marked American advances. The Third Army was driving northeast toward Frankfurt, cutting through German territory with the casual efficiency of a farmer's plough cutting through soil. To the north, the First and Ninth Armies were advancing in parallel. To the south, the Seventh Army was pushing through Bavaria. The Reich was being carved into pieces, and there was nothing the Wehrmacht could do to stop it. He thought of all the promises. The Atlantic Wall would hold. The Allies would be thrown back into the sea. Secret weapons would turn the tide. The German people would rise up in a levée en masse and drive the invaders out. All lies, all fantasies, conjured by men who refused to accept reality until reality crushed them. The truth was simpler and more terrible. Germany had lost the war the moment it attacked the Soviet Union while still engaged with Britain. It had lost the war when it declared war on the United States after Pearl Harbor, and it had lost the war when it believed that fighting spirit and tactical excellence could overcome strategic stupidity and material disadvantage. The Wehrmacht had been the finest army in the world in 1940, but wars were not won by being the finest. They were won by being strong enough and smart enough and lucky enough to outlast the enemy. And Germany had run out of all three. In the town of Hammelburg, 60 miles east of Frankfurt, American tankers of the 4th Armored Division rolled through streets lined with white flags. Civilians watched from windows with expressions that mixed relief and apprehension, glad the fighting had passed them by but uncertain what occupation would bring. Private First Class Robert Mitchell, gunner on a Sherman named Thunderbolt, watched the faces go by with a detachment born of exhaustion. Mitchell was 23 years old and felt 50. He had joined the Third Army in France, had fought through Lorraine and the Battle of the Bulge, had crossed the Rhine and pushed into Germany with a fatalistic acceptance that this war would end only when one side could no longer continue. He had lost friends, had seen Shermans burn with crews trapped inside, had fired his 75mm gun at German positions until the barrel glowed red and his ears rang with permanent tinnitus. But he had also witnessed something that gave him pride mixed with horror. He had witnessed the industrial might of America weaponized and deployed with ruthless efficiency. Every time his Sherman was damaged, mechanics repaired it or replaced it. Every time they ran low on ammunition, supply trucks appeared with fresh shells. Every time they needed fuel, tankers arrived as if summoned by magic. The Third Army was a machine fed by the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh and Chicago, sustained by the oil fields of Texas, and driven by a general who understood that modern war was not about elegance, but about maintaining pressure until the enemy collapsed. "Think we'll make it to Berlin?" asked Corporal James Washington, the driver, his voice crackling through the intercom. Mitchell considered the question. They were deep in Germany now, farther than most Americans had imagined they would reach 6 months ago. The war that was supposed to end by Christmas 1944 was instead dragging into spring of 45. But the end was visible now, approaching with the inevitability of sunrise. "Eisenhower says we're not going to Berlin," Mitchell replied. "Says it's been allocated to the Russians. We're heading for Czechoslovakia, I heard. Going to link up with the Red Army somewhere in the middle." Washington grunted, a sound that conveyed disappointment and relief in equal measure. Berlin would have been a prize worth claiming, a symbol of total victory. But Berlin also meant heavy fighting, street-to-street combat against defenders who would fight to the death because they had nothing left to lose. Czechoslovakia, by contrast, promised lighter resistance. The German forces were crumbling, surrendering in droves to American units because surrender to the Americans meant food and medical care and eventual repatriation. Surrender to the Soviets meant an uncertain fate in the vast prisoner camps of Siberia, where men disappeared into labor battalions and were never heard from again. The Sherman rumbled forward, its engine purring with the reliability that American engineering had prioritized over sophistication. The Third Army had captured 32,763 square miles of German territory in its advance from the Rhine to the Elbe, taking dozens of cities and processing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. The territory captured represented roughly the size of Austria, conquered in less than 2 months of continuous operations. German commanders, surveying the wreckage of their forces, struggled to comprehend how an army could sustain such operational tempo. The answer lay not in superior tactics or brilliant generalship, though Patton possessed both in abundance. The answer lay in the unglamorous realm of logistics and industrial production. America had built 100,000 tanks during the war, more than double what Germany had produced. America had trained millions of soldiers, had established training camps that turned civilians into competent infantry in 16 weeks. America had mastered the art of amphibious operations, of strategic bombing, of long-range supply chains that stretched across oceans. Most importantly, America had leaders willing to learn from mistakes and adapt. The Sherman tank was inferior to German Panthers and Tigers in direct combat, but it was reliable, easy to maintain, and produced in numbers that overwhelmed German defences. American infantry tactics in Normandy had been costly and sometimes clumsy, but by the Battle of the Bulge, they had evolved into effective combined arms operations. Patton himself had learned from the failures of the Lorraine campaign, had refined his approach to breaking through fortified positions, and had developed methods for maintaining supply lines even during rapid advances. April 14, 1945. General George S. Patton stood before a formation of his officers at Third Army headquarters, now established in the Bavarian town of Bad Tölz. He had been promoted to 4-star general that day, recognition from the War Department for his accomplishments over the past 9 months. The promotion came with a sense of anticlimax. The war was nearly over. German resistance was collapsing across the entire front. Weeks, perhaps days, the Wehrmacht would cease to exist as a fighting force. Patton delivered brief remarks, thanking his officers for their service, praising the courage of the enlisted men, noting with satisfaction that the Third Army had fulfilled every mission assigned to it. But his mind was elsewhere, already looking beyond victory in Europe to the Pacific, where war against Japan continued to rage. He had requested transfer to the Pacific Theatre, had begged Marshall to bring him to that war in any capacity. The request had been politely deferred. There would be no Pacific command for Patton. Instead, he would become military governor of Bavaria, a political position for which he was spectacularly unsuited by temperament and training. The role required diplomacy, tact, an understanding of the complexities of occupation, policy, and denazification. Patton possessed none of these qualities. He was a warrior, not an administrator. His genius lay in mobile warfare, in the rapid exploitation of breakthroughs, in maintaining offensive momentum against determined resistance. Peacetime governance bored him, but in that moment, standing before his officers, Patton could look back on an achievement that would secure his place in military history. The Third Army had advanced further and faster than any American army in history. It had demonstrated that with sufficient industrial backing, with aggressive leadership, and with soldiers willing to endure hardship, an army could operate at a tempo that overwhelmed even competent enemies. The 600-mile advance of the title, while somewhat hyperbolic when measured as a straight line, accurately reflected the cumulative distance the Third Army had covered from Normandy to Czechoslovakia, fighting through France, Luxembourg, Belgium, Germany, and Austria. German generals who had initially dismissed Patton as a cowboy, a showman lacking in serious military competence, had learned to their cost that he was something far more dangerous. He was a general who understood that in industrial warfare, operational tempo was a weapon, that maintaining constant pressure prevented the enemy from recovering balance, that speed could compensate for tactical imperfection. The cost had been high. The Third Army's casualties, 16,000 killed, 96,000 wounded, 27,000 missing, represented a staggering toll in human suffering. Each number was a man who had embarked on a journey from small-town America to the battlefields of Europe, who had endured training and transport and combat, who had perhaps died quickly in the flash of a shell burst, or slowly in the agonizing hours after being wounded. Behind each number was a family receiving a telegram, a mother learning that her son would not return, a wife discovering that she was now a widow, children growing up without fathers. But the cost for Germany had been far higher. The 1.4 million German soldiers killed, wounded, or captured by the Third Army represented a catastrophic loss of manpower that the Reich could not replace. These were not merely numbers on a casualty report. They were men who would not return to rebuild their shattered nation, who would not father children to replace the generation lost to war, who would not contribute their labor to the decades of reconstruction that Germany would require. The cities the Third Army had captured, Frankfurt, Weimar, Bayreuth, Nuremberg, Munich, bore the scars of their liberation. Bombing had reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble. Artillery had shattered centuries-old architecture. The cultural heritage of the German nation lay in ruins, a price exacted for the crime of launching a war of aggression that had killed tens of millions across Europe and beyond. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. In the prisoner of war camps that dotted the American rear areas, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers waited for processing and eventual repatriation. Some were sullen and defiant, still convinced that Germany had been betrayed by weak leadership rather than defeated by superior force. Others were relieved that their war had ended without death or permanent injury, grateful that they had surrendered to the Americans rather than the Soviets. A few, the perceptive ones, understood that they had witnessed the death of a world and the birth of a new one, in which military prowess alone would no longer determine great power status. Lieutenant Colonel Hans Dietrich Genscher, captured during the final collapse of German resistance in Bavaria, sat in a prisoner cage near Regensburg and composed a letter to his wife that the censors would never allow through. In it, he attempted to explain what he had witnessed, what it meant for Germany's future, what lessons might be drawn from the catastrophe that had consumed his nation. "We were told we were the master race," he wrote, "that our will and our discipline would carry us to victory. We believed that superior training and better doctrine would compensate for American material advantages. We were wrong. The Americans did not defeat us through brilliance or exceptional skill. They defeated us through abundance and determination. They built more tanks than we could destroy, trained more soldiers than we could kill, produced more supplies than we could intercept. And they had leaders, particularly this General Patton, who understood that modern war rewards speed and aggression more than careful planning." He paused, wondering if his analysis was correct, if he had truly grasped the fundamental dynamic that had led to Germany's defeat. Then he continued, "We fought with excellence and lost to sufficiency multiplied by determination. The Americans were not perfect soldiers, but they were good enough, and there were always more of them. That is the lesson we failed to learn. That is why we are here, behind wire, while they prepare to go home as victors." The letter was found among Genscher's possessions when he died in 1978, yellowed with age but still legible. Historians would later cite it as one of the most perceptive analyses by a German officer of why the Wehrmacht, despite its tactical prowess and individual courage, had lost the war so decisively. The truth Genscher recognized was simple but devastating. Excellence without resources is merely a way of dying more heroically. In the decades after the war, military historians would debate Patton's legacy endlessly. Some would argue that he was overrated, that his accomplishments owed more to overwhelming American material superiority than to personal genius. They would point to the Lorraine campaign as evidence that Patton could be stopped when facing determined resistance and good defensive terrain. They would note that his rapid advances often left his supply lines dangerously extended, that his aggressive tactics sometimes resulted in unnecessary casualties. Others would argue that Patton represented a new paradigm in warfare, that his understanding of operational tempo and his willingness to take calculated risks had shortened the war and ultimately saved lives by preventing German forces from establishing successive defensive lines. They would note that the 6 months between the Third Army's advance across France and the final surrender of Germany in May 1945 represented one of the most successful campaigns in military history, measured by territory captured, enemies defeated, and strategic objectives achieved. The German generals who had faced Patton would offer their own assessments, often grudging but increasingly respectful as the years passed and passions cooled. Hermann Balck, who had commanded German forces at Metz, admitted in his memoirs that Patton's decision to attack the fortress directly, while costly, had prevented Black from conducting an organized withdrawal of his forces and had tied down German divisions that might have been used more effectively elsewhere. Otto von Kabelsdorff, who had faced the Third Army along the entire length of the Lorraine campaign, noted that Patton's relentless pressure had prevented German forces from ever establishing a stable defensive line. Perhaps the most telling assessment came from Hasso von Manteuffel, who had commanded the 5th Panzer Army during the Battle of the Bulge. In an interview conducted in the 1960s, von Manteuffel was asked if he had been surprised by Patton's rapid response to the Ardennes offensive. His answer was simple and devastating. "We knew he was capable of it. We simply hoped he would not do it. When he did, we knew our offensive had failed." That was the essence of what the Germans had learned about Patton and the Third Army. They were capable of things that violated established military doctrine, capable of sustaining operations at a tempo that should have been logistically impossible, capable of absorbing losses and continuing to advance, and they had a commander who not only understood these capabilities but exploited them ruthlessly to maintain constant offensive pressure. Against such an enemy, positioned to fight a defensive war with diminishing resources, the Wehrmacht had stood no chance. The war ended on May 8, 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender. The Third Army, positioned in Bavaria and Czechoslovakia, had advanced approximately 600 miles from Normandy, had fought continuously for 281 days, and had helped destroy the most powerful military machine Europe had ever produced. The soldiers of the Third Army, those who survived, would go home to parades and medals and the gratitude of a nation that understood, if only dimly, what they had accomplished. But they would carry with them memories that no parade could erase. Memories of friends killed in sudden violence, of German civilians starving in ruined cities, of concentration camps liberated to reveal horrors beyond comprehension. They had witnessed the face of total war, war fought without restraint or mercy until one side could no longer continue. They had been instruments of that war, and the experience had marked them permanently. Patton himself would not survive long enough to enjoy the peace he had helped secure. On December 9, 1945, his staff car collided with an American truck on a road near Mannheim. The accident broke Patton's neck, paralyzing him from the neck down. He lingered for 12 days in terrible pain before dying on December 21st. Some would later suggest conspiracy, assassination by those who feared his outspoken anti-Soviet views. But the evidence suggested only a tragic accident, a random twist of fate that killed a warrior who had survived countless battles. The Third Army would live on, would serve in subsequent conflicts, would carry forward the traditions established in those bloody months of 1944 and 1945, but it would never again operate with the freedom and the scope that Patton had enjoyed, and would never again race across hundreds of miles of enemy territory with such devastating effect. That moment had passed, and had belonged to a specific time when American industrial might was at its peak, when enemies were clearly defined, when victory meant total conquest rather than limited objectives. The Germans, rebuilding from the ruins, would learn the lessons the Third Army had taught them. The new German military, the Bundeswehr, would emphasize mobility and rapid response, would study American logistics and operational doctrine, would understand that in modern war, the army that could sustain operations longest would ultimately prevail. The excellence they had prized in 1939, the tactical brilliance, the superior training, the advanced technology would be married to a more realistic understanding of industrial capacity and strategic sustainability. And on quiet nights, in officers' clubs and veterans' gatherings, men who had worn field grey would speak of that terrible winter when an American general had pivoted an entire army in 3 days, when columns of Sherman tanks had appeared where no tanks should have been, when the sky had darkened with aircraft, and the earth had trembled with artillery, and the inexorable tide of American material supremacy had finally, definitively, broken the Wehrmacht's back. They had faced many enemies during the war, the Soviets with their massive numbers and ruthless determination, the British with their methodical professionalism and stubborn refusal to quit, but it was the Americans, with their industrial abundance and their aggressive leadership and their willingness to trade material for speed, who had shocked them most profoundly. because the Americans had proven that in industrial warfare, sufficiency multiplied by determination would always defeat excellence limited by scarcity. The lesson had been taught with shells and bombs and the blood of millions. It was a lesson Germany would not need to learn twice.